Why are there still Confederate flags waving around in America? Civil War was like 150 years ago. I don't know the answer to this question. What I do know is how to play the accordion. That does not answer the question though. To answer the question, we're going to watch why is the South obsessed with Civil War. And I know it is because I've watched many videos about the Gettysburg Battle, about the Civil War. South was and is still obsessed with the Civil War. What's up with it? As an Estonian, I cannot judge. I'm not judging. I just want to know what's going on.
The American Civil War drew to a close over 150 years ago, ending a period of 5 years during which the southern states of the United States formed their own independent confederacy. The North won the war and the United States were restored, ending the South's period of self-rule. However, the memory, imagery and iconography are still very much remembered and—
Look at this flag, yeah, this is the flag of the Confederates. I remember one of the first GTAs, actually the first GTA I played was GTA 2, the one that you view from up above your character. And one of the gangs was American Confederates, like the Southern Gang or something. They had the flag as a Confederate flag and you had to earn their respect or something, so yeah. This is how early I found out about it, through video games.
Revered in the former Confederacy. The removal of several statues in New Orleans of Confederate Generals Robert E. Lee.
Yeah, look, that's Robert E. Lee. Why are you gonna remove this guy? He was a genius. Even if he lost the war, he was a genius. I just made a video about oversimplified Civil War, and you know, half of the video is about Lee, basically, so Lee, basically, puns. Why are you gonna remove him? If you know why they removed them, write it in the comments.
And PGT Beauregard got me thinking about the way in which the Confederate past is viewed in the South, as the events and symbolism of over a century and a half ago still evoke strong emotions today. The Confederate past is certainly unmissable in the South. There are statues of Confederate officers in major cities, and much of the population proudly defend their right to flying various Confederate flags. Most popular of all, the horizontal Confederate battle flag, often displayed with the slogan, "Heritage, not hate." Flags have been a surprisingly controversial issue in the South in the last few years, after the removal of the battle flag from South Carolina's State House in 2016. Many of the former Confederate states' own state flags have symbolism relating to the Confederacy's previous flags. Alabama's flag is based on the 60th Alabama Infantry's battle flag.
Even nowadays, still nowadays, they have strong ties to their Confederate past, right? And they still hold their culture close to the Confederate culture, and I don't think the South views itself as being occupied till nowadays. I don't think that's the case. I think they think of themselves as the great United States, but if you go closer, it's still South and the North.
And follows a similar design to that of the Confederate battle flag. Georgia's many flags over the years all harken back to a connection with the Confederate state flag, or battle flag, as do that of Mississippi and North Carolina. Hundreds of street names in the South are also named after important Confederate figures such as General Lee, Beauregard, Pickett, Stonewall Jackson, and others. But why does the South have this obsession with its Confederate past of over 150 years ago?
Yes.
When many are calling it out to be a racist one, intertwined with white supremacist ideals and the oppression of black people. To understand the South's fascination with the Confederacy, we have to go back to when it was formed in the heat of the antebellum, before the nation was consumed by war.
Antebellum? What is an antebellum? I have no idea.
The reasons why the United States erupted in all-out civil war are much debated, and it's safe to say there were many different factors contributing to it.
I mean, if you want to know the reasons, it's oversimplified. Outlines it pretty good, I think. Go watch the video.
The North-South divide, state rights, abolitionism, honour, religion, free labour, constitutionalism and republicanism all played an important part in why the Confederacy seceded and why war broke out, although all of these factors were in some way connected to the large elephant in the room: slavery. The entire economy in the South was based around it, and would fail to function without the forced labour provided by the enslaved African workforce, who overturned a huge profit for their white masters on the cotton, tea, sugar and tobacco plantations of the South.
Yeah, I haven't seen real photos of slavery. I've seen movies like Django Unchained and all of that stuff from Hollywood, but this is a real photo, right? We see a lot of black cotton workers here and just one white guy with a gun. It underlines quite specifically what's going on here, so yeah.
A future without slavery was not one in which the South would remain the agrarian and economic powerhouse it was. When it became clear that abolitionist Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate of the 1861 election, would win the race for president, South Carolina acted first and declared independence from the United States on the 20th of December, 1860. Soon most of the southern states also seceded to stand with South Carolina and form the Confederate States of America. South Carolina's motivation for self-rule was certainly the ability to keep her African slaves in bondage, although some of the later states that joined...
Yeah, I talked about it also in the oversimplified video. I haven't seen it. I will repeat myself. It's for me as an Estonian, our nation was a slave state, slave nation for 800 years for German nobility, producing food to them basically and coin. It's very impossible for me to understand how can you fight and truly fight for slavery. I understand if you fight in the South for your way of life, for your religion, for your view of life, but slavery is a topic so specific. I couldn't imagine anyone justifying it wholeheartedly. Justifying violence like that. I can't. For me, it's very hard to understand.
The rebels did so to stop Northern soldiers marching across their territory to do battle with the secessionists to the south. The war began with the Confederate bombardment of Union forces in Fort Sumter, which was now in Confederate-occupied Virginia, on the 12th of April. The course of the war in the East would be one of defending Northern advances into the South, like at Bull Run in 1861, followed by failed probes north, like at Antietam in 62. The victories...
Yeah, I've yet to watch the Battle of Antietam. You guys say it's the bloodiest day, not the bloodiest battle, but the bloodiest day, and everybody in America seems to know about it. So I gotta watch a separate video about it. I wanna know what happened in Antietam by detail. I will, but right now we're not gonna focus on it.
At the stalwart defense of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville might have lulled the soldiers on the Eastern Theatre into a sense that the South was winning the war, although in reality the fall of New Orleans early on by assault from Union steamships and the tightening of the trade embargo, crudely named the Anaconda Plan, was slowly sucking the life from the Confederacy. When Lee's final push north was bloodily beaten down at Gettysburg in 1863, the end of the South's independent experiment was in sight. The war from that point was fought predominantly on Confederate soil until General Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia in April of 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse. With the defeat of the Confederacy in 1865 came the spread of the Lost Cause.
See, 1865. In Estonia, slavery was abandoned 1816. In Estonia, and we were a small nation under the Tsarist Russia, still almost a half a century before the United States. This goes to show that US was actually lacking behind in the first world, at least, lacking behind in the updates of social status. You know, slavery was very a thing of the past in Europe, and the nobility looked at it as it's this whole thing, we don't want it, it's dirty. They looked upon it like that. They didn't want to touch it, they didn't want to even mention it anymore. It was like, oh, this whole thing, we're moving forward from that now, but US was lagging behind. But better late than never, you know, look where US is now, so...
Which argued that the South had been hopelessly outgunned and outmanned against a far superior northern foe, yet had held out for 5 years before the final capitulation. For many Southerners returning home, this is how they and their fellow countrymen viewed the war, as the glorious struggle against hopeless odds, which was doomed to eventual failure from the start. The fact that outnumbered, largely newly formed and inexperienced Confederate armies under the now legendary generals like Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee had ever inflicted decisive military defeats on the trained Federal Army of the United States at all made their efforts all the more praiseworthy to Southerners.
So it's like this ideological fairy tale story they have, like the story has built itself up even more throughout the time, right? At the time it was war, sides against sides, but now it's like this idea, oh, the smaller guy versus the bigger guy, against all odds, all of that stuff. So it's quite easy to fall into that, actually.
The way the final defeat of the Confederacy was brought home by the Union also contributed to a heroic attachment of the Civil War and the Confederate past. Northern Generals Sherman and Sheridan employed scorched earth policies, destroying vast areas of the South's infrastructure, property, and what little industry there was. Sheridan was famous for the Burning Raid of 1864, which specifically targeted the livestock and houses of Confederates.
It was basically a scorched earth policy. They just fed off the land, as we learned in the previous video. They fed off the land, they destroyed farms and industries. Their goal was to destroy everything southern on their path, to cripple southern economy and industry, and just cripple the enemy. Destroy the people, then the army will collapse. That's the modern tactics they used. Again, all of that I found out in the previous video, oversimplified civil war. But it's hard for me to understand, because civil wars are wars against their own people, America versus America. Scorched earth policy would be the last means of resource if you fight against a foreign enemy. But if you use that for your own people, for me it's conflicting for me. I can't, it's too much.
In the Shenandoah Valley, resulting in the killing and displacement of over 10,000 cattle, and the destruction of hundreds of buildings and the burning of tens of thousands of tons of crops. Sherman's more famous march to the sea in Georgia might have been forgotten in the North soon after the war, but stayed rooted in the South's memory of the Northern invasion of their homeland. With the invasion came the inevitable contact between Union soldiers and Confederate civilians, and with it the inevitable violence and sexual violence invading armies often bring with them. Though Lincoln had issued orders strictly prohibiting any violence, sexual or otherwise, against the Southern population, the war is rife with it. Because of the Union's actions...
Yeah, whatever you might say, whoever you might view as historic, or as heroic in history, war is war. And there is no sides that don't do evil. All sides. If there is war, there is no righteousness anymore. Even U.S. soldiers, I don't want this video to be, I don't want to bring these things up, we all know about them, but U.S. soldiers also have committed war crimes. They cannot be compared to other sides, because U.S. is one of the best in democracy and not committing these things. It's one of the more righteous sides of the world, but it still also has done these things. And also in the Civil War, I'm pretty sure things like rape and executions happened. Again, I don't want to focus on that, because that's not my point. I just want to bring it out that war is war, and all sides turn into pretty much the devils.
To bring the war to a close in 1864 and 1865, Southerners could justify the secession and their ancestors' reasons for fighting in the first place as fighting to defend their homes against Northern invasion. Because of this distinction, many Southerners see this as the real reason for the Civil War, and therefore feel justified in their honouring the Confederate past, where others liken it to the Nazi past in Europe. In some ways, Southerners are justified to this belief. Although the figure is debated, only around a third of men fighting for the Confederacy owned slaves themselves, and gave their reasons in diaries, letters, and songs as being the defense of their states against what they saw as tyrannical Northern oppression and meddling in Southern state affairs. It's also important to remember the human cost of the Civil War, the accepted figure sitting at 620,000 deaths, although it's likely closer to 750,000. Although the traditional figure cites 360,000 Union deaths and 260,000 Confederate deaths, it's likely there were more Southern deaths not recorded due to the loss of records and muster rolls when the South was invaded. Even when using the traditional figure,
back then it's crazy number. I know religious wars and wars before have been more bloody, but still, First World at that time was already a very high economic status. And America was a very evolved economy already back then compared to the world. America was the first world and one of the more involved economies, US was already pretty rich back then. And to have a war like that, I'm sure it shocked the world also, not only the US.
It becomes instantly clear how destructive the Civil War was for the United States, but especially the South. 1 in 5 Southern white males aged between 13 and 43 died during the Civil War. 2% of the entire population perished in the Civil War from both sides, and it can be seen as an American Holocaust because if a proportional amount were to die in the United States today, 6 million lives would be lost. Though more men...
Not connected, but I just want to compare it to the greatest losses of World War II. Poland lost a quarter of their population. Just over quarter of the population. In US terms, that would be even over 60 million. I know you cannot compare them, of course. I don't want to bring it in, oh, Poland lost much more. Just an interesting connection. But yeah, 2%, and today it would be 6 million. Imagine if a war would happen on US soil right now and 6 million would die. I can't even imagine. No, US is the leading country in the world. It couldn't happen. It just couldn't happen, right?
From the north were killed. The impact was far greater for the south, which had a much smaller population and no huge cities like New York or Boston, where huge numbers of men enlisted to fight. The traditional total of 620,000 killed was not equaled by all American military deaths until the Vietnam War in the 70s. The huge scale of those who fought and died affected everyone in the South without a doubt, and more so than in the North, which is perhaps why the memory of the Civil War is so much stronger to the south of the Mason-Dixie line. The period of Reconstruction in the South, from the end of the war until 1877, is also important for the solidification of the Southern mythos about the war, and understanding its importance to many Southerners today. After the destruction of the scorched earth policies employed both by Northern generals and retreating Southern troops, the South was left in ruins. Reconstruction involved the...
It's so hard for me to see these things because war is the most pointless thing man can do. And even if you have a very evolved society, as they did back then already, 100 years before the Civil War and 100 years and at the time of the Civil War, huge breakthroughs in any field had happened. It was almost a modern day of era actually. New weaponry, new medicine, new educations, new sciences, and boom, you have a war like that, and you destroy your own people, your own land, your infrastructure. Hell, in a few years the first car would be invented. And you gotta build that all up again. It takes billions of dollars, billions of, hours of work. Why war exists? Why are people so stupid? Damn it, war is dumb.
Of the former Confederacy by Northern soldiers who facilitated the emancipation of black people, and after the Republican landslide of 1867 radically reconstructed the South, enabling the former slaves to vote and hold office for the first time, which many of them did. The white Southerner in the meantime had not only lost a war but also a way of life. The slave-based Southern economy that had been so successful in the antebellum years suddenly collapsed, affecting everyone in the South when black people were no longer the legal property of their masters. In the post-war years, during both the Reconstruction and later eras, most black and white Southerners were living in abject poverty. Part of the North's main Reconstruction goal was the reconstruction of the Southerners' minds, which involved thousands of...
Okay, yeah, that's a good point, living in poverty. I just connected that. Imagine if 4 million in the... How many? Let's say 6 million slaves all across the US get free at the same time, right? Before that, they lived with their masters, which sounds horrible, I know, but now they gotta find jobs and gotta make a life for themselves, and the South hates them also. They would be living in poverty. So immediately 6 million citizens of US would be living a life of poverty and trying to get out of that life, trying to, evolve. This connects to even nowadays why black statistics are in crime and in wages, everything, they're lower than white statistics because they had a very rough start in US, very rough start. And it's not equal, even nowadays it's not equal, and it has never been equal. It takes, I think, many more generations for it to be fully equal. Now, I live in Estonia, again, we do not have we don't have even different races here, we just have Estonians and Russians, no, nothing more. So if I miss something, if I say something wrong, you gotta forgive me. And don't go all crazy in the comments, oh, how can you say that, you're stupid? A lot of you Americans do that sometimes. I don't want to generalize, I just read some of the comments saying that, oh, I don't know stuff. I'm Estonian, I'm not supposed to know much of that stuff. I say what I know, and for me it seems like, yeah, it's a very unequal start for the black statistics, for the black demographics to start their lives. Coming out of slavery, they just lived in poverty, I think, for a few generations. And the segregation happened in the 60s, so they still had a whole century of being viewed as lesser men, lesser people.
Northerners settling in the South to teach Northern values in Southern schools. 60 of these men, who became known as carpetbaggers, were also elected to Congress on a radical Republican platform. Without the carpetbaggers' intervention and us creating an us and them situation in the South, perhaps Reconstruction would have been more successful, and the memory of the Civil War might have been put to rest. The hardships of the Reconstruction era for many Southern whites would have made the Civil War seem all the more justified, as in hindsight they could argue why their ancestors had fought was to avoid the future they were now living in under Northern oppression. This would explain a Southern idolization of the Civil War and the Confederacy in the post-war era when poverty and carpetbaggers were an issue in the former Confederate states. But this idolization has not gone away. One correlation between the post-war years and the South of more modern times is the general and widespread poverty faced by its people. The Huffington Post wrote that the South is essentially...
Okay, I just figured out I have actually never been to the South. I was in West Coast, I only lived in Hollywood, and in East Coast I went to several cities, but they were all in the North. So I never went to the South. And I am going to visit US again, I promise you that. I lived there in poverty basically 3 years in Hollywood, so I had a bad memory of it, but now I want to redeem it and go back, and I will let you guys know when I go. Maybe next year, maybe this year, I will go and I will visit the South also. I will make a road trip or whatever I do, I will decide, and we can even make a meetup if you guys want to. But I'll be coming to America, and then I'll see the South also, because now I'm super interested about it. Never knew anything about this stuff. Now I know.
A solid, grim block of poverty, which has in essence been true of the South since the end of the Civil War, even after the monetary intervention during Reconstruction. The US Census comparison of 2000 to 2010 shows that the South as a geographic entity was by a large margin that with the most people living in poverty, and had the second largest increase in people living in poverty over the decade. When viewing this on a map in the context of the former Confederacy, there is a very clear distinction between the former Confederate states and the rest of the United States, but especially contrasting with those states that had opposed them in the Civil War, with the exception of West Virginia. The popular image of a Southerner, especially that of a Southerner with an attachment to the old Confederate imagery, is the stereotype of the white trash redneck hillbilly.
Yeah, it is, and I've even portrayed that stereotype in my videos, like, yeehaw, Texas, Cowboys, America, woo! I've done that stuff a lot, not knowing where it comes from. Now I understand. It has long historical roots with, connected to true patriotism. They love their state, they love their country, and they feel like they have been cheated a bit. I'm not taking sides here, I'm just understanding a bit more where does it come from.
People waving and defending Confederate flags are often belittled by the media for being uneducated, backward, and the likelihood is that someone displaying or defending the imagery of the Confederacy will be on average poorer than someone opposed to it. The debate on Confederate imagery, such as the public and state display of the Confederate battle flag, or statues of Confederate politicians like Jefferson Davis, or Confederate generals like Robert E. Lee and General Pickett, is often viewed as a racial one between white supremacist Southern whites and their historically oppressed Southern blacks. However, the debate is increasingly a social one, with both white and black people defending and opposing the memory of the Confederacy, and it's being more divided along socioeconomic lines, rather than the issue being a black and white one. When looking at the issue in a cultural historic light, it is perhaps also not surprising that Southerners choose the Civil War as their well from which to draw their cultural heritage and background. When comparing a shared Southern American...
So it says that also black people fought in the Confederate army, but I'm sure the percentages were really small, and also percentages of black people sharing the Confederate view right now are very, very small, because it's mostly white, right? Because it's connected to the far right, it's connected to, sometimes you can see the swastika here. I don't know the truth, but I would assume blacks have very little to do with the Confederate flags and Confederate mindset right now.
Identity and a European, say Dutch, shared identity, it becomes very apparent that the Southern American has far less history to choose from. Most Southerners have only ancestry in the New World for only around 200 years, and given that this is the shared aspect of their identity they have in common with their fellow Southerners, it limits the choice. For Dutch people, there is a shared history already starting before the Romans, but really becoming clear with the founding of the County of Holland, and such shared features across what would become the Netherlands, like language and some aspects of culture. The nation was born from the flames of the 80 Years' War, when the Dutch had to fight for their freedom against the Spanish, followed by the Golden Age, when the Dutch were the most advanced nation on earth, with a global mercantile empire, dwarfing that of England and other world powers at the time. Even in the defeat of the French invasions under Napoleon, led to a more cultural unification between Dutchmen.
Yeah, you can see that the European nations have very long roots. Even Estonia, like our people have lived on this soil for 2,000, 3,000, maybe 6,000 years even. We did not have this culture as we do now. This culture we have now was given to us by Germans basically, but still this culture goes back still thousands of years. And you connected that topic to America, and South and North both have a very short culture of their own, because if they want to go back to the culture of European nations, it's not their culture. So the New World is their culture. It's not the Native Americans' culture. It's their own culture. It's only 200-300 years maximum. So the South, if they want to preserve their own culture, they do not have much to choose from. Like if Estonians, we want to preserve our culture, we can choose from various different ways. The Soviet occupied Estonia, the Tsarist occupied Estonia, the pagan Estonia, the Christian Estonia. Every one of those have tens of generations of culture. But US can only choose amongst 300 years of cultural evolution, which is not that much, not that long ago. Yeah, again, don't take this as judgmental. I'm just saying that US is a new world. And everything they have is new, basically. Not a bad thing, but if you have to specify your culture against, different from the Northern American culture, your choice is very narrow to choose from.
With the return of the House of Orange in 1813, with the following years of monarchy. Even then, the German occupation during the Second World War also brought unity for Dutch people, and today the Netherlands still punches far above its weight for such a small country that has literally been struggling against the sea throughout its lifetime. Now let's take a look at the South's cultural history. The first colonization of the South came from Spanish settlers in Florida, the English, Irish, Scotch-Irish, and the Scottish in Virginia and the Carolinas, the Germans in Texas, and French settlers in Louisiana, as well as a general spread throughout the South of all of these groups. The American Revolution saw much action in the territory that would later become the Confederacy, although by far the most influential conflict fought there would be the Civil War. Tom Ritchie discussed in his video the idea of the Confederacy as another, un-American entity, thus foreign, and in this light we can see the secession of the southern states as the foundation of an independent nation. National sentiments between different groups are very strong, for example the national sentiment of the Scottish, even though they are very much alike their English neighbours. Much of the following history of the American Southerner directly influenced by the war, the humiliation of defeat, reoccupation, Reconstruction, and then the debacle of the Jim Crow era, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, and the violent opposition of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. When viewed in a timeline like this, it becomes clear why Southerners chose the Civil War as their era of cultural and regional identity, which provides very strongly today. From a nostalgic...
Yeah, because you cannot pick the settlement area, because these are European people, European cultures who are settled in America. You cannot pick the humiliation or Ku Klux Klan, because it just doesn't do. You cannot pick that. It's not possible. So of course, Civil War. You were independent. You had your own thing going. Of course, they're gonna pick that. It makes much more sense to me why nowadays they specify that part of their history. It's not the only part, but they bring it out because that was the part where they were in the picture. They were doing what they wanted to do, and they were separate, and they stood out. The whole world knew South as a separate entity back then.
The Civil War and antebellum era can be seen as times of faded glory for white Southerners, when their men and women held out against those who now stereotype them as rednecks and racists for 5 years, and handed them several defeats before the descent of the South into a long slump infused with poverty, deprivation, and racial violence and horror by the likes of both the Jim Crow authorities and the Ku Klux Klan. And that history has been less than flattering. In reality, the Confederacy was no paradise for both its white subjects or its black slaves, who would have remained in bondage indefinitely, and the prospect of an independent South, though an interesting topic for alternate history theories, would have been far more difficult in realization. But this is the irrelevant to the modern Southern mythos concerning the Confederate memory, which is
Yeah, because if you look back in the past and you wanna specify a certain era, you wanna bring it out or paint it better than it was, you're not gonna focus on the negative. You only bring out the positive stuff and you forget the negative. I think even people living in the South praising the Civil War era, they don't bring out the negative. There were negative stuff. I'm pretty sure there were negative aspects. I'm quite even sure they don't know about them. They don't bring them out and they don't even know about them.
Twined with what actually happened. They lost, their independence was taken from them, and the slaves were freed. After the war, efforts were certainly made to return the South to its antebellum state, although this is a recurring pattern throughout history, where one dominant group loses power, and a small fraction of this group then work, often by terrorist means, to regain it, with terrorist action against the other group. In the South, this is no exception, with groups like the Ku Klux Klan targeting predominantly black people.
Okay, question: is the Ku Klux Klan active nowadays? I've read something about it. I know it's pretty evil, but is it active nowadays? Does it really do what it used to do in the 60s and 50s? Does it do that nowadays?
In their attempts to reassert white, or in other words Confederate, authority over the lands that had once formed the Confederacy. Thanks to the Ku Klux Klan, who often used Confederate symbolism, which was indeed started by Nathan Bedford Forrest, a Confederate general, this has often also been mixed into the equation of the Confederate heritage, as the Ku Klux Klan and the post-war era in the South, is now also an unmistakable part of that history. So why hasn't this more recent racially oriented history of violence altered the Southern obsession with the Confederacy? And what conclusions can be drawn from this analysis of the Civil War? To begin with, the Southern backdrop to the war is seen differently. They see it as the necessary fight to keep the Union soldiers from committing the atrocities and enforcing federal laws upon them, which they did later on in the war. The average soldier's reasons for fighting certainly weren't limited to, or even necessarily included, the continued existence of slavery, but sought to protect the newly formed nation.
Yeah, that was always my question about it. How can you fight for slavery? Now I understand that they didn't fight for slavery. Some of them did, but most of them went short. I'm finding out now that no, they had their own reasons, and maybe even propaganda was behind it, as it was in the North, but also in the South, that the North is coming and doing all these things. They're monsters, as it happens in war. It's propaganda that might have been behind it. Fear that your homes are taken, fear that your lifestyle is taken, but not specifically slavery.
A nation that to their mind followed the American Constitution as laid down by the Founding Fathers, against the tyranny of a radical Republican government. Nostalgic yearning and attachment to everything Confederate also has some grounds in the past and present. On average, the richest area in 1860 is now the poorest area, and the antebellum South, which exported 75% of the world's cotton, had a sense of regional, national and international pride and importance.
The richest area is now the poorest area. That is weird. Yeah, of course, it changed everything in the South. It changed black to white. Literally black to white.
For Southerners, the war then can be interpreted as a war fought to preserve this way of life, but a way of life which vanished and dashed the South into 150 years of poverty and deprivation after they lost. The war too can be seen as a solely Southern affair rather than a civil war. It was fought because of the South's secession. It was fought for the vast majority in the South. Those targeted were Southern soldiers and Southern civilians, and resulted in the occupation of the South, followed by the steep economic decline of the South. Due to this, it can easily be argued that if the South had won and occupied the North, then the North would hold somewhat a similar view as many Southerners.
I'm sure the North would hold the same view. If South would imply their laws on the North, it would be the opposite. The North would be forced to accept slavery again. They would be forced to accept the laws, de-industrialize perhaps, grow more cotton, whatever it might have been, and it would have been the opposite.
Referring to their past today, inclusive or exclusive of a history of slavery and a subsequent racial violence. There is obviously no Northern lost cause myth, although perhaps a Messiah complex, with with a certain degree of snobbery aimed at the backward rebellious Southerners, also alienated post-war Southerners who, poor, defeated and looked down upon, may eagerly have taken up the Confederate rebel heritage as one of defiance, simply because the North and politically correct aspects of society told them that they couldn't. The South's obsession with the Confederacy, then, can be seen as one of honouring ancestors they believed fought on the right side of history because of Northern atrocities during an invasion of the Confederacy, and that out of the South's history, the Civil War is by far the most defining aspect, which has irrevocably influenced it from 1865 up until today, so it should come as no surprise that this obsession with the Confederate past exists in the first place.
Every video I watch opens up more and more about why things are the way they are in America. Weird things work in weird ways in USA. We wouldn't understand them as in European. European nations have developed so differently. Our social structures, everything is so much different. We view American structures sometimes, the demographics and everything is like, what the hell is going on there? But people need to watch these videos to understand why the most powerful country in the world is sometimes so weird, and sometimes people might even say it's backwards in some ways, but now I understand why and what are the historical roots of this. And it's much harder to laugh or judge it if you know what's really going on, that there's blood and history behind it. You know, people tend to make fun of America. I have made it also. I mean, I make a lot of humor, don't take it seriously. I understand it now. I understand it much more. I'm gonna watch many more videos about American battles, American history. It's getting more and more interesting to me by the day, actually. I never did it in the past. I thought it's, I don't want to. Why, you know? Europe is much more interesting. But now, I like the USA history. I'm gonna do much more videos. Thank you, my friends, for watching. Please support the channel through Patreon. Patreon is in the description below. Also, get the cup. I drink tea from it every time I watch anything. And this is my cup, my only merch. So please go and get it to support the channel. It's a very nice cup. In the next video, I'll read out all of the names who have gotten the cup. There's pretty many of them already. Thank you to all of these people. Thank you if you are a patron. And as always, my friends, until my next video, stay cool and bye bye.